Hi, my name is Garrett Goodwin. This is my Geography 356 mapping project. I'm going to be talking about alternative energy use and CO2 emissions in Europe. So the purpose of this project is to compare two variables across all of Europe. And the easiest way to do that is to use the location quotient, which is really just the ratio of a quantitative value for a defined area to a specific norm. So here's the equation LQ equals SI over A. So for this project, S sub I is the variable for the specific country, and A is the norm of Europe as a whole. So I got my data for 44 countries from World Bank. Alternative and nuclear energy use was percentage of total energy use for that country. CO2 emissions were given as metric tons per capita. So both of those were fairly straightforward to calculate the location quotients by simply dividing each country by the average for Europe. I used mapchart.net to generate graduated color maps. My hypothesis is that I expect CO2 emissions to decrease as alternative energy use increases. And the reason for this, as you can see in this chart, the majority of CO2 emissions come from producing electricity. So obviously, as you use renewable energy, wind and solar, you should not have pollution coming from electricity production. So here's my first map for nuclear and alternative energy use. As you can see, kind of the more technically developed countries sort of lead that. One that really stands out is Iceland, and on the map it doesn't show up as much, but the location quotient is actually 6.05, and a lot of this has to do with their isolation as far as transporting fossil fuels, things like that. It's a lot more difficult when they're so far away. And also they have a lot of tectonic plate activity, so they really use geothermal energy a lot. Because of that, and it works really well for them. France, Sweden, Switzerland, all about 3.0, really kind of leading the way in a sense. And then the EU has put forth this initiative, and they have three 20% goals by 2020. And I'll get into the other two later, but this first one, they want all the EU as a whole to be 20% alternative and nuclear energy use as of the whole energy production. And this graph below really shows how wind and solar power have sort of jumped in the last few years. Hydropower has kind of been around the longest and sort of stayed consistent, but the wind really has taken off recently. So here's my map for CO2 emissions. As you can see, a lot of Central Europe, heavily populated, high population density, a lot of population pressure. So kind of expect a lot of CO2 emissions. And then sort of a low location quotient for many of the Eastern European countries. So Belarus, Ukraine, countries in that area, which the low CO2 can really be tied to the fall of the Soviet Union. So they're kind of lost all the heavy industry, which would have been contributing to the pollution. So again, like I mentioned earlier, there's three parts to this EU initiative. The first one was 20% renewable energy use. The second is 20% cut in greenhouse emissions from the 1990 statistics. And the third is 20% increase in energy efficiency. And part of this initiative that they have allows the countries to work together, and they're given a certain allowance of CO2 emissions, and they're also allowed to sort of trade some of that allowance. So if a country is doing really well as far as emissions, they can sort of sell off some of that allowance to countries that are going to break past their goal. So looking at the two maps side by side, obviously you want to be red up here with high alternative and nuclear energy use, and then preferably be violet, blue, um, green. So really, Iceland, France, and Sweden are sort of leading the way in that front. Sort of the example that everybody's trying to go for, and using a lot of alternative nuclear energy to produce electricity, and it also ties into more technology that's used in other industries, and will certainly help cut the pollution. On the negative side, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Estonia, Russia, they're really pulling down the EU statistics. So there's sort of a big push on those countries to sort of get it going and catch up with the rest of the EU. So in conclusion, there's really not a huge correlation between alternative energy use and CO2 emissions. The main thing that I maybe pull from it a little bit is that the more alternative energy use you have, the more likely you are to be below the norm for CO2 emissions. Again, comes down to technological advancements. Obviously, if you have the technology to harvest renewable energy, you're going to have similar technologies to cut emissions. So I expect this correlation to increase by 2020 as that EU initiative continues, and more pressure is sort of put on the countries that are pulling down the EU statistics. So that concludes my mapping project. Thank you for watching.